In the rolling countryside of Bavaria, about 40 miles north of Munich, lay a small, lonely farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. It was 1922. The world was still recovering from the Great War, and much of rural Germany was gripped by poverty and silence. The farm sat far from any main road, hidden by woods and uneven fields, a place so isolated that even locals sometimes forgot it existed. To the casual eye, it seemed peaceful, smoke rising gently from the chimney, the clucking of chickens, the rhythm of rural life undisturbed. But to those who knew the Gruber family, that peace was only a fragile illusion. The head of the household, Andreas Gruber, was a stern, proud man of 63. Years of labor had carved deep lines into his face, and his reputation in the nearby town of Bern was that of a man both respected and quietly feared. His wife, Cecilia, shared his sharp features and hard temperament, her back bent slightly from decades of toil. Living with them was their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, a woman in her mid-30s, gentle but marked by tragedy. Her husband had died in the Great War, leaving her with 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph, whose paternity would later become a shadowed question in the investigation. The Gruber farm was prosperous by rural standards. They kept cows, pigs, and chickens, and their fields yielded a steady crop of grain. But wealth in the countryside often brought something else: isolation. The nearest neighbors were half a mile away, the closest town nearly an hour's walk. The family lived in a world of their own, surrounded by endless fields and thick Bavarian forest. As winter began to fade into early spring, the snow thawed slowly, revealing mud paths and old footprints frozen in time. The villagers passed the farm occasionally, tipping their hats to Andreas or exchanging brief, cautious words. He was known for his temper, for harshly correcting those who crossed him, and so most preferred to keep their distance. But something strange had begun to change at Hinterkaifeck. In the final months before the tragedy, the family seemed uneasy. Visitors spoke of Victoria appearing distracted, of Andreas staring toward the woods more often than usual. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, had quit her job months earlier. Claiming she heard footsteps in the attic at night, she told others that she felt she was being watched, that objects in the house seemed to move when no one was around. Andreas, ever skeptical, dismissed her fears. Yet even he had begun to notice things he couldn't explain. One cold evening, as snow fell softly across the fields, Andreas stepped outside with a lantern. He had heard something earlier, a faint creak above the ceiling, as if someone had shifted their weight on a floorboard. He shone his light toward the barn and froze. In the snow leading from the forest to his farmyard was a single set of footprints. They led straight to his front door, but there were no tracks leaving. The snow was fresh, untouched. He followed the prints slowly, heart pounding against his chest. They ended right at his door. He turned his lantern toward the woods again, but the forest stood silent, indifferent. The next morning, he told his family what he had seen. Cecilia, practical as always, brushed it off. Perhaps it was a stray traveler or a hunter. Victoria seemed uneasy. She mentioned that she had heard strange sounds too. Soft tapping from the attic when the wind was still, muffled voices when she was alone with the children. Andreas searched the house and barn thoroughly, but found nothing. The attic was empty. Yet that night, when he went to lock the doors, he discovered something even more unnerving. The key to the tool shed was missing. He had always kept it in a particular place, and now it was gone. The following days grew colder. A newspaper appeared on their doorstep that no one in the family had purchased. Victoria assumed a neighbor had dropped it off, but when Andreas asked around in the village, no one claimed to have visited the farm. Then came the faint sounds again. Footsteps when the family was asleep, creaks and whispers above them. The Grubers began locking their doors earlier and keeping lamps lit through the night. Even the animals seemed nervous. The cows restless, the dog barking at nothing, the horse stamping in its stall. Still life continued. The routine of feeding animals, cooking meals, and tending to the fields carried them forward. But something unseen had already begun to claim the house. A presence that watched, waited, and studied them. Neighbors would later recall that in the last week before their deaths, Victoria spoke often about her fear. She even tried to borrow money to leave the farm with her children, but Andreas forbade it. This was his land, his home, and he would not abandon it because of superstition. By the time March ended, Hinterkaifeck had become a place of quiet dread. Strange footprints in the snow, missing keys, whispers in the attic, a newspaper no one bought. To outsiders, these were coincidences, fragments of a rural imagination. But for the Grubers, they were warnings written in the stillness of their own home. The kind of warnings no one understands until it's too late. In the coming days, those same villagers would walk that muddy road again, not to exchange greetings, but to find a silence so complete it would haunt them forever. For on that lonely farm, beneath the gray Bavarian sky, something had already crossed the threshold, and it would leave no one alive to tell the tale. The final days before the tragedy at Hinterkaifeck unfolded in a strange, unsettling rhythm, a sequence of moments so ordinary that their hidden dread went unnoticed until it was far too late. It was the end of March 1922. The snow had begun to melt, and muddy tracks wound through the fields like veins. A faint mist hung over the land each morning, clinging to the roofs and fences. To the villagers of Grobern, it was just another cold Bavarian spring, but to the Gruber family, it felt as though the world itself had begun to watch them. Andreas Gruber rose before dawn, as he always did, his boots thudding across the floorboards of the farmhouse. His breath smoked in the chill air as he lit the stove and went out to the barn. The animals stirred at his arrival, cows snorting, the horse stamping nervously. He worked in silence, though lately even silence seemed to have a sound. Faint creaks and sighs that followed him from room to room. He had stopped mentioning them aloud. Each time he had, Victoria would grow pale and tell him not to frighten the children, and he would bark back that ghosts existed only in church sermons. Yet as he shoveled hay and heard something shifting above the rafters, his hands paused mid-motion. The sound was soft, deliberate, a slow drag, as if someone were moving across the attic beams, just beyond his line of sight. He lifted the lantern, its light trembling over the wooden planks, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement. Then nothing. The silence pressed close again. Back inside, Victoria was preparing breakfast. Her daughter, little Cecilia, sat at the table tracing shapes in the steam on the window pane. "Mama," she said suddenly. The man was outside again. Victoria froze, spoon half raised. "What man?" "Darling," she asked gently. The girl turned to her, face pale. "The one from the forest. He was by the barn last night." Victoria forced a smile, though her stomach tightened. "You must have dreamed it," she said, but Cecilia shook her head. "He had no face." After breakfast, Andreas went to town for supplies. The villagers noted that he seemed more irritable than usual. At the blacksmith's shop, he complained that someone had been trespassing on his property, that he'd found footprints leading from the woods straight to his door, and none going back. When the blacksmith suggested it was a prank, Andreas snapped. "Pranks don't steal keys." He muttered that his tool shed key had vanished days earlier and accused his former maid of carelessness. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Rural gossip spread fast, and some already whispered that strange things were happening out at Hinterkaifeck. No one dared say it to his face. That evening when he returned, the family ate in near silence. Victoria tried to lighten the mood, humming a hymn as she cleared the table. Her mother, Cecilia Sir, frowned at her. "You shouldn't sing after dark," she said softly. "It draws things near." The older woman crossed herself, then added, "I hear them too, at night." Andreas glared. "Enough of this foolishness. It's rats. That's all." But later, when everyone had gone to bed, he lay awake listening, not to rats, but to what sounded like slow, heavy steps overhead. The next morning brought a small but chilling discovery. Out in the snow by the barn, Andreas found faint footprints again, half melted now but unmistakably human. They led around the house, across the yard, and vanished near the woodpile. He followed them, heart pounding, but found no one. When he returned inside, he noticed the back door latch sitting open, though he was sure he'd locked it. "Victoria!" he barked. "Did you leave this unlatched?" She shook her head. The older Cecilia crossed herself once more. The tension in the house thickened, until even the air seemed heavier. That same afternoon, a neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer stopped by to check on them. His history with the family was complicated. He and Victoria had once been close, and many whispered that her young son Joseph might be his child. Lorenz greeted Andrea stiffly, the two men standing several feet apart. He asked about the farm, the animals, the weather, anything except the tension between them. When Victoria appeared in the doorway holding Joseph, Lorenz's expression softened for a moment before hardening again. "You should come to church on Sunday," he told her. "You've been missed." She smiled faintly but said nothing. He left soon after, walking down the muddy path. Halfway to the main road, he glanced back and swore he saw someone watching from the attic window, but the figure vanished when he blinked. As night fell, the unease deepened. The wind pressed against the shutters like whispering hands. Little seed Zelia began crying, insisting she heard someone talking in the walls. Her grandmother hushed her, holding her close by the fire. Andreas paced the floor, muttering that the villagers were trying to scare him off his land. "No one will drive me away," he growled, but when he went outside to secure the barn door, he felt eyes on him, that prickling sensation along the neck that no logic can explain. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, and he thought he caught a faint trace of tobacco smoke in the cold air. No one in the house smoked. Friday, March 31st, began gray and heavy. Clouds hung low, pressing the horizon. At midday, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived from a nearby town. She was a quiet woman in her 40s, grateful for the job but uneasy about the stories she'd heard. Victoria welcomed her kindly, showing her around the farmhouse. Maria noticed the silence immediately, not peaceful but watchful. While unpacking her small suitcase, she glanced toward the narrow ladder leading up to the attic. Dust fell softly from the boards above as though disturbed by movement. She froze, clutching her rosary. When Andreas passed by the hall, she nearly asked if someone else was up there, but his grim expression silenced her. Throughout the day, the atmosphere grew stranger still. A repairman passing the farm later reported that he'd seen an unfamiliar newspaper on the porch, one from Munich that none of the family subscribed to. Inside, Andreas accused Victoria of wasting money on it. She swore she hadn't bought it. No one ever learned where it came from. The newspaper was gone after the murders, perhaps taken by whoever had brought it. By evening, as the sun bled into the forest, Maria prepared supper. The children played quietly, too frightened to wander far from their mother's side. Andreas sat by the stove sharpening a small axe, its edge gleaming orange in the firelight. Victoria tried to make conversation, about planting season, about visiting the church again, but he barely answered. "We'll manage," he said gruffly. "We always have." Yet even he seemed distracted, glancing toward the windows every few minutes as if expecting someone to appear. The dog began barking furiously. Andreas stood muttering and went outside. The yard was empty, the barn dark. He stepped inside, lantern raised, the warm smell of hay mingling with something else. Something sour, like old breath. The animals shifted nervously. He called out, his voice echoing off the wooden beams. No answer. As he turned to leave, he thought he heard a faint sound above him, a whisper or sigh. He waited, heart hammering, then dismissed it with a curse. When he re-entered the house, Victoria asked what it was. "Nothing," he said, but he didn't meet her eyes. Night swallowed the valley. The family locked their doors and doused the lamps. Upstairs, the children slept fitfully. Maria lay awake in the servants' room, clutching her blanket. She could hear soft creaking from the attic again, slow, measured, as if someone were walking in circles directly above her. She whispered a prayer, too afraid to move. Down the hall, Victoria sat up in bed listening too. In that silence, every sound magnified. The ticking clock, the soft breath of her mother in the next room, and then footsteps descending the attic ladder. The noise stopped halfway, then a faint click, like a latch being opened. Victoria reached for a candle, but before she could light it, the sound ceased entirely. She waited, pulse racing, until exhaustion finally claimed her. It was the last night she would ever sleep. Outside, the mist thickened, creeping across the fields. From the edge of the forest, a faint light flickered, maybe a lantern, maybe something else. The dog barked once more, then whimpered into silence. In the attic, unseen, a figure crouched near the beams, waiting for dawn. When morning came, the village carried on as always. Smoke rose from distant chimneys, children ran through muddy lanes. No one knew that only a few miles away, the Gruber family had already stepped into the final hours of their lives. The tracks from the forest still led to their door, and still, none led away. The night of March 31st, 1922, fell upon Hinterkaifeck like a heavy curtain, sealing the Gruber family inside their fate. The day had been long and gray, but by evening the clouds broke open, scattering cold rain that froze into thin sleet as it touched the ground. The wind moaned across the empty fields, carrying with it the damp scent of pine and distant chimneys. Within the farmhouse, the single lamp on the kitchen table flickered, casting trembling shadows along the walls. No one in the valley could have known that by the next morning, every living soul inside that home would be dead. Andreas Gruber was the last to retire that evening. He checked each door twice, muttering to himself as he moved through the house. He made sure the barn latch was secured, the stable closed, the dog fed. As he stepped into the cold air for the final time, he glanced toward the dark edge of the forest. A thin mist lingered between the trees, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure standing there, still, upright, and watching. When he blinked, it was gone. He told himself his eyes were playing tricks in the half-light, but as he re-entered the house, the hairs on his neck stayed raised. Inside, Victoria was putting the children to bed. The older girl, little Cecilia, clung to her mother's dress. "Mama, can we sleep in your room tonight?" she whispered. "Why, sweetheart?" Victoria asked, kneeling beside her. The child hesitated. "Because I heard the man again. He was whispering upstairs." Victoria's lips tightened. "There's no man here," she said firmly, smoothing the girl's hair. "You'll see. Everything will be fine in the morning." But even as she said the words, a sound came from the attic, a faint scrape like wood sliding over wood. Both mother and daughter froze. Victoria forced a smile and whispered, "Go to sleep now." She extinguished the candle, but her eyes stayed open long after the room went dark. In the main bedroom, Andreas and his wife lay in separate beds, as they had for years. Their marriage had long turned to routine and silence. From the next room, Andreas could hear his daughter humming a hymn under her breath, the same one she had sung at dinner. It calmed him for a moment, then irritated him. He turned on his side, facing the wall, and tried to ignore the dull ache in his bones. Somewhere outside, the dog began barking again, a low growl deep in its throat. "That damned animal," he muttered, pulling the blanket tighter. His wife whispered from across the room, "Maybe you should see what it is." Andreas grumbled but didn't move. He was tired, and the world beyond his bed felt wrong, charged with something unseen. Time passed. The wind eased. The farmhouse settled into uneasy silence. The clock downstairs struck midnight. In the barn, the cattle shifted restlessly, their hooves clattering softly on the wooden floor. The horse stamped, snorting at something beyond the stall door. The dog's chain rattled once, then went still. If anyone had been awake to listen, they might have heard another sound. Faint footsteps on the packed dirt of the yard, slow and deliberate, moving toward the barn. The door creaked open. A lantern flickered briefly, though no hand held it. Inside, the air grew colder. The animals began to stir, their breathing louder now, uneasy. A shadow passed between the stalls, gliding noiselessly across the hay. The axe, which Andreas had left leaning against the wall earlier, was no longer there. Back in the house, a noise woke him. It was the cow's restless bellow, followed by the dog's muffled whine. He sat up, listening. "What now?" he muttered, swinging his legs to the floor. His wife stirred but said nothing. He took his lantern and stepped into the hall. The boards creaked beneath his weight. For a brief moment, he considered going back, but pride was stronger than fear. He opened the door and stepped into the freezing night. The barn stood dark except for a sliver of light under the door. "Who's there?" he called. Only the echo of his voice answered. He raised the lantern, pushing the door open. Inside, the horses stamped and snorted. He moved toward them, muttering under his breath, and then stopped. There was movement behind him, a whisper of air, the faintest crunch of hay under a boot. He began to turn, but the blow came fast and hard. The lantern fell shattering, spilling fire across the straw before sputtering out. Darkness swallowed the barn. Another blow followed, then another, heavy, final. The animals screamed. Somewhere in the house, a child began to cry. Victoria heard the noise and froze. She waited for her father to return, but when several minutes passed and the yard stayed silent, She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The cold hit her immediately. She called softly, "Father." No answer. Only the faint rustle of the forest. She hesitated, then walked toward the barn, the lantern in her hand casting a weak circle of light. The door stood half open, swaying slightly. She stepped inside, and what she saw made her drop the light. Her scream echoed across the fields, cut short by a sudden movement from the shadows. The axe came down again. Inside the house, old Cecilia stirred in her bed. She had heard the scream. "Victoria," she called weakly. When no answer came, she rose, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She reached the back door just as the figure appeared, outlined by the dim glow of the lantern still burning in the yard. She had only a moment to realize what she was seeing before the blade struck. Her body fell in the doorway, half inside, half out, the shawl soaking in the mud. Upstairs, little Cecilia lay frozen under her blanket. She could hear footsteps downstairs, slow and deliberate. Then silence. The door creaked open. The faint smell of iron filled the air. She hid her face in the pillow, whispering to herself. When the figure reached her bedside, she did not scream, only whimpered once before the room went still. In the nursery, the baby Joseph slept on, oblivious, until the footsteps returned. A shadow fell across the crib. The axe descended one final time. Hours passed. The storm outside faded. The farmhouse grew silent again, the kind of silence that feels heavy and absolute. In the barn, the horses calmed. The dog whined softly, then lay down. The killer, whoever they were, did not leave. Instead, they stayed. They covered the bodies with straw and blankets, arranged tools neatly, and even fed the animals. Smoke rose again from the chimney the next morning, a detail that would later baffle investigators. Someone had stoked the fire in the Gruber house long after the family was dead. By dawn, the valley looked unchanged. From the main road, Hinterkaifeck appeared as it always did, quiet, self-contained, unremarkable. No one in the nearby town suspected anything unusual. Yet inside that house, the walls dripped with the echo of violence, and the air reeked faintly of blood and smoke. Whoever had entered that night had known the house well. Its doors, its habits, its silences. They had moved with purpose, not frenzy. Every strike deliberate, every sound measured. The killings were not random. They were methodical, and as the first light of April 1st crept across the frozen fields, the killer still lingered inside the house. Tending the farm, eating from the family's pantry, listening to the wind whistle through the broken boards. The world outside went on, oblivious to the horror sealed behind those wooden walls. Hinterkaifeck stood as it always had, lonely, quiet, and now unspeakably still. For 4 days after the murders, Hinterkaifeck stood silent beneath the gray Bavarian sky. Smoke rose from the chimney at odd hours. The animals were fed, the cows milked, and the dogs' barking could be heard faintly by those who passed on the distant road. From the outside, it looked as though life on the Gruber farm carried on as usual. Yet behind the wooden walls, the family was already decomposing in the cold spring air, and whoever had taken their lives seemed in no hurry to leave. On Saturday, April 1st, neighbors noticed that no one from the Gruber family had attended church in Grove Burn, an absence that immediately drew attention. Victoria was a member of the choir and rarely missed a Sunday service. When she failed to appear again the next day, people began whispering that something must have happened. At first, they assumed illness. Perhaps the flu had struck the entire household. But by Monday, when the postman arrived and found the letters from the previous week still uncollected, unease began to ripple through the community. The postman knocked, called out, and listened. No answer. He did notice, however, that the barn door was slightly ajar, and inside he heard the muffled lowing of hungry cows. He hesitated, then decided not to enter. Something about the silence felt wrong, like a held breath. He left the mail on the porch and walked away quickly. Meanwhile, several townsfolk reported seeing smoke from the Gruber's chimney that same morning. To them, it meant someone was alive inside. Perhaps Andreas was too ill to come to town. Still, the longer the silence continued, the stranger it felt. On Tuesday, April 4th, a mechanic named Michael Plielsukiel was sent to the farm to pick up an order of grain that Andreas had promised to deliver. When he arrived, he found the outer gate closed but unlocked. The dog, chained outside the barn, barked viciously at him, foam around its mouth. Michael called out, waited, then stepped into the yard. The stillness was suffocating. He later said the place felt wrong, like walking into a graveyard. He loaded the grain himself, left payment on the table in the stable, and departed without seeing a single person. That night, he told his wife he would never return there alone again. By Wednesday, worry turned to fear. The schoolteacher, who taught little Celia, reported that the girl had not been seen since the previous week. Victoria's friends from church grew anxious. Finally, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the same neighbor who had visited days before the murders, decided to act. On Thursday, April 6, he gathered two men, Johann and Michael Seigel, and the three set out toward Hinterkaifeck. It was early afternoon, gray and windless, the path muddy beneath their boots. As they approached the farm, they noticed the same thing others had, smoke rising faintly from the chimney. Someone's home, Johann said. Lorenz frowned. Then why hasn't anyone come to town? The gate creaked as they entered the yard. The dog lunged against its chain, barking so fiercely that Lorenz flinched. Its eyes were bloodshot, its fur matted and caked with dirt. They called out first politely, then louder. No reply. After several minutes, Lorenz decided to check the barn. The door was closed but unlatched. He grasped the handle, hesitated, then pulled. A heavy smell hit him immediately, sweet, metallic, unmistakable. Death. He stepped inside, the others following behind. It took their eyes a moment to adjust to the dimness. Shafts of sunlight cut through gaps in the wooden planks, illuminating piles of hay, and then they saw it, a boot sticking out from beneath the straw. Lorenz's stomach turned. He bent down, brushing away the hay, and froze. Beneath it lay the body of Andreas Gruber, his skull crushed and his face barely recognizable. Next to him lay his wife, Celia Sisser, her gray hair soaked dark with blood. The men stepped back, horrified, only to uncover more. Beside the parents lay Victoria and her daughter, little Celia, both sprawled together, straw clinging to their hair. Victoria's hands were raised as if to shield her face. The child's small fingers were twisted in her mother's dress, clutching even in death. All four had been covered with hay, as though someone had taken the time to hide them, not hurriedly, but with deliberate care. For several moments, the men could not move. The silence pressed against their ears. The cows lowed softly from the stalls as if nothing had happened. Finally, Lorenz whispered, "We must check the house." His voice trembled. He led the others through the connecting door into the farmhouse. The air was heavy, thick with the same cloying smell. In the bedroom they found Joseph, the 2-year-old, lying dead in his crib, his tiny head crushed. On the other side of the hall, the maid Maria Baumgartner lay face down on the floor, her skull split open. The beds were unmade, the food from Friday's supper still on the table, mold creeping across the bread. Whoever had done this had not only killed them, they had stayed. The discovery spread through Groburn like wildfire. Within hours, dozens of villagers crowded the farmyard, whispering prayers and crossing themselves. Some wept openly, others just stared at the barn as if it were cursed ground. The local police were called, but rural Bavaria in 1922 was a place where resources were scarce and procedure uncertain. The first officers to arrive were unprepared for what they saw. They cordoned off the area, but curious townsfolk kept wandering through, leaving footprints, touching things, disturbing potential evidence. One officer later admitted that the scene had been trampled by half the village, before the investigators from Munich even arrived. When the Munich detectives finally reached Hinterkaifeck 2 days later, they were greeted by a scene of chaos. The corpses had been moved, the barn half cleared of straw, and the tools scattered. Still, certain details chilled even the most experienced among them. The family's money was untouched. Jewelry lay undisturbed, nothing appeared stolen. In the kitchen, a plate of food had been eaten recently, after the murders. The fireplace showed signs of use, and when the ashes were sifted through, police found scraps of burnt fabric and what looked like fragments of a newspaper, possibly used to wipe something clean. On the floor, faint muddy footprints led from the door toward the attic ladder, then vanished. It soon became clear that the killer had remained on the property for days after the murders. The animals were well fed, the cows milked regularly. Fresh bread had been baked in the oven. The chimney smoke witnesses saw had indeed come from someone living inside the house, someone who had spent the weekend among the dead. He lived there. One investigator murmured. He lived with them, after killing them. The thought made even the hard-nosed officers shudder. As word spread beyond Gröbern, journalists began arriving from Munich and beyond, their notebooks ready, their curiosity morbid. They described the house as tomb in the fields, isolated and cursed. The press dubbed it Das Geisterhaus, the ghost house. Some wrote that the family had been murdered by a vagrant, others that it was revenge, or madness, or even something supernatural. The villagers avoided the path to Hinterkaifeck altogether. Mothers warned their children not to look toward the forest at dusk, yet the investigators continued their grim work, piecing together fragments of a story that refused to make sense. They found that the blows to each victim's head had been delivered with the same weapon, a mattock, a kind of farm axe. None of the wounds were haphazard. Each was precise, almost surgical. Victoria's skull was crushed but her face nearly untouched, suggesting hesitation, or perhaps recognition. Little Cecilia's injuries were different. Her hair was torn out in clumps, as if she had pulled at it in terror before dying. The doctors estimated that she might have survived for several hours after the attack, lying beside her dead mother, slowly bleeding to death in the straw. It was this small, unbearable detail that made even the police look away. By the end of the week, the autopsies were completed right there in the barn, a grim spectacle that drew even more onlookers. The corpses were then buried in Gröbern cemetery, though the heads were sent to Munich for further examination. They never returned. The investigators later admitted that the skulls were lost during the chaos of the war years that followed. A haunting footnote to an already dreadful story. When the police finally sealed the property, the farmhouse stood hollow and silent again. Yet villagers claimed to see lights moving inside at night for months afterward. Some heard the dog howling long after it had been taken away. A few swore they saw smoke from the chimney again, even after the place was abandoned. Whether these stories were born from fear or something else, no one could say. Hinterkaifeck had become more than a crime scene. It was now a legend whispered in the dark, the kind that seeps into the soil and never lets go. And though the investigators packed up their evidence, leaving the house to rot, the mystery only deepened. For no clear motive, no suspect, no confession ever came. 6 bodies, 1 farmhouse, and a silence so absolute it felt alive. Whatever had happened on that lonely patch of Bavarian earth, it had left behind a darkness that the wind itself seemed unwilling to carry away. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders began under a gray April sky that seemed to mirror the confusion in the minds of those tasked with solving it. By the time the Munich police arrived, the crime scene had already been compromised beyond repair. Dozens of curious locals had trampled through the barn and house, leaving behind a chaotic mixture of footprints and fingerprints. Some had even taken small souvenirs, pieces of straw, scraps of wood, anything to say they had been there. For the detectives it was a nightmare. Every clue was contaminated, every trail half erased. Yet even in that confusion, there remained evidence too strange to ignore. Chief Inspector Georg Reingruber, a veteran investigator from Munich, took personal charge of the case. He was a pragmatic man, not easily shaken, but what he found inside Hinterkaifeck disturbed him deeply. The sheer brutality of the murders was unlike anything he had seen. Each victim had suffered multiple blows to the head, yet there were no defensive wounds that indicated a struggle. Whoever the killer was, he had either surprised them completely, or they had trusted him enough to let him approach without fear. That detail haunted Reingruber more than any other. The first theory was simple robbery. A vagrant or drifter passing through the countryside could have broken in, killed the family, and fled with valuables, but this theory collapsed almost immediately. Nothing was stolen. Money was found untouched inside the house. Gold coins, banknotes, even jewelry. The killer had taken lives but ignored wealth. A second theory emerged: revenge, perhaps a business dispute, a grudge from the past, or something darker. Andreas Gruber was not a well-liked man. He was known to be harsh, domineering, and quick to anger. Neighbors whispered that he had enemies, men he had cheated or insulted, people who would have gladly seen him dead. But few believed any of them capable of such calculated savagery. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered the ugly heart of the Gruber household. For years, Rumors had circulated about the relationship between Andreas and his daughter Victoria. Villagers whispered that he had forced himself upon her, and that the boy Joseph might not be her son at all, but her half-brother. Court records confirmed that Andreas had once been convicted of incest and imprisoned, though both father and daughter had returned to the farm afterward as if nothing had happened. To outsiders, the family appeared respectable. Inside, it was a prison built of secrets and shame. The revelation sent ripples through the investigation. Suddenly, the motive no longer seemed financial. It might be personal, even moral. Someone might have sought to punish them. The name that surfaced most often was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who had discovered the bodies. Years earlier, he had courted Victoria after her husband's death in the war. Many in Gröbern believed he intended to marry her, until Andreas forbade it. Some said Lorenz still loved her, others whispered that he was the true father of Joseph. His behavior on the day of the discovery struck some as suspicious. He seemed too calm, too composed. Witnesses claimed he handled the bodies without hesitation, even entering the house alone while others refused to cross the threshold. He unlocked doors from the inside as if he knew the layout intimately. When asked how he had done that, he claimed the doors were already open. But the detail raised eyebrows. Could the killer have been standing among the search party, pretending to be shocked? Ryan Gruber questioned Lorenz extensively. The man denied everything. He admitted his past affection for Victoria and even claimed paternity of Joseph, though he could not prove it. "I loved that family," he told the police. "I wanted to protect them." His grief seemed genuine, but doubts lingered. Why had he waited nearly a week before organizing a search? Why had he acted with such confidence at the scene? Some said guilt made him bold, others argued that familiarity with the farm explained his behavior. With no physical evidence against him, the police had no choice but to release him. Yet suspicion clung to his name for the rest of his life. The next theory involved a stranger in the attic. In the days leading up to the murders, Andreas had told neighbors about strange noises overhead. Footsteps, shifting objects, whispering sounds at night. He had even discovered footprints leading from the forest to the house, but none leading back. These reports, once dismissed as the ramblings of an old man, now seemed prophetic. The investigators scoured the attic and found faint traces of habitation, a depression in the straw, a discarded newspaper, crumbs of food. Someone, it seemed, might have been living above the Grubers for days or even weeks, watching them, studying their routines. The idea was horrifying. The killer hadn't arrived suddenly, he had already been there, waiting in the shadows. But who could sustain such a nightmare? The police turned to the forests and villages surrounding Hinterkaifeck. They interviewed traveling laborers, soldiers returning from the war, anyone who might have drifted through unnoticed. Dozens of names emerged, none led anywhere. One suspect, a carpenter who had once worked for the Grubers, was said to have vowed revenge after a financial dispute. Another, a vagrant seen near the property days earlier, vanished completely. Each new lead unraveled into dust. The killer remained a ghost, walking between rumor and silence. As weeks turned into months, desperation crept into the investigation. Psychics were consulted, seances held. In one infamous session, a clairvoyant claimed that the murderer's name began with an L, and that his spirit still haunted the farm. Reporters seized on the story, portraying the case as cursed. The Hinterkaifeck murders became more legend than crime, blurring the line between fact and folklore. For Ryan Gruber, it was a humiliation. "We are chasing a shadow," he wrote in his notes, "and the shadow mocks us." Still, there were tangible oddities that refused to fade. Witnesses recalled seeing a man in a long coat standing at the edge of the forest days after the murders, staring toward the farm. When approached, he disappeared into the trees. Another claimed to have found a bloody handkerchief near a well miles away. Though testing it yielded nothing, one farmer swore he had sold a mattock matching the murder weapon to a stranger months before. But the buyer's identity was never discovered. Every clue seemed to lead to another dead end, another faceless possibility. As time passed, the villagers grew more fearful. Some locked their doors for the first time in their lives. Others refused to go out after dark. Children were warned never to take the forest path. The farm itself stood empty, yet people claimed to hear noises coming from it at night. Footsteps, whispers, the lowing of unseen cattle. Hunters who passed nearby said their dogs refused to go near the place. It was as if the land had absorbed the violence and now exhaled it in slow, chilling breaths. The authorities eventually brought in new experts. Forensic teams from Munich examined the weapon, the wounds, and the scene again. They concluded that the killer had used the farm's own mattock, meaning it likely came from the property itself. That suggested someone familiar with the place. The doors showed no signs of forced entry. Either the killer had been invited in, or had lived there all along. Once more, suspicion circled back to Lorenz, but also to the possibility that Andreas had angered someone who knew his habits intimately. The incest conviction made him a pariah. Perhaps someone believed they were delivering divine punishment. Despite months of investigation, the police could not solve the case. Files piled up, reports grew repetitive, and witnesses' memories began to blur. Eventually, the trail went cold. Officially, the murders remained unsolved, a mystery frozen in time. Yet the story did not end there. Over the decades that followed, new theories emerged like ghosts rising from the mist. Some believed the killer was a returning soldier, unhinged by the trauma of war. Germany in 1922 was full of broken men, veterans haunted by what they had seen, drifting through the countryside. Perhaps one had stumbled upon the farm and lost control. Others insisted the culprit was someone from the family itself, possibly Victoria's long-dead husband, returned secretly from the front lines. Records did show a soldier with a similar name unaccounted for after the war. Could he have discovered his wife with another man, consumed by rage and betrayal? The notion was romantic in its horror, but unprovable. Then there were the supernatural explanations. The farm's isolation and the eerie events leading up to the murders invited darker speculation. People spoke of curses, of spirits driven by sin and shame. Some said the ghost of an unborn child wandered the fields. Others believed the attic noises were never human to begin with. In a village still steeped in old beliefs, such stories found fertile ground. Evil lived in that house, one old woman told a journalist decades later, and evil stayed. By the time the files were closed, Hinterkaifeck had become a wound that refused to heal. The land was eventually sold, the buildings torn down, the materials burned, but the story lingered. Every few years, a new investigator, writer, or historian would reopen the case, convinced they could find the truth that eluded everyone else. None did. The evidence was gone, the witnesses dead, the echoes fading into time. All that remained were photographs of the barn, the faces of the victims, and the silence of the fields where it all happened. For Chief Inspector Reingruber, the case haunted him until his death. In his final report, he wrote a single line that seemed to sum up everything. The hand that killed them was known to them. And that is why they opened the door. The murders at Hinterkaifeck did not end with the discovery of the bodies. They began there. What lingered afterward was worse than the killings themselves, a fear that soaked into the soil, a silence that pressed against the walls of every farmhouse in Grubern. For months after the crime, the valley felt haunted. The laughter of children disappeared from the fields. The church bell echoed through emptier streets. People no longer lingered outside after sunset. They locked their doors, drew their curtains, and prayed that whatever had come to the Grubers would not return for them. The farm, meanwhile, stood as a black mark on the landscape. From a distance, it looked like any other homestead, a cluster of wooden buildings, a barn, a small orchard. But up close it radiated unease. The smell of decay hung in the air long after the bodies had been removed. Flies gathered around the barn door. The dog barked at shadows until it was finally taken away. The fields grew wild, untended, as though the earth itself refused to yield crops where blood had soaked it. Those who passed by claimed they could hear strange sounds at night, footsteps on gravel, the creak of the attic ladder, a faint humming that seemed to come from beneath the ground. Most people avoided the path altogether, choosing longer routes to town rather than cross the cursed property. The local pastor, Father Has, held a special mass for the victims. The church overflowed. Faces pale and drawn, villagers listened as he spoke of sin, forgiveness, and divine mystery. He told them that some things belonged only to God, that justice would come in another world. But even as he said the words, he admitted later, he felt eyes watching him from the back pew. a gaze cold and steady, from someone he could not quite see. When the service ended, a storm rolled over the valley. Thunder shook the windows. The congregation scattered home through rain and mud, their prayers drowned by the sound of wind. As spring turned to summer, the gossip shifted from grief to speculation. Everyone had a theory. Some swore Lorenz Schlittenbauer was guilty, others pointed to nameless vagrants or bandits from the railway lines. A few whispered that it had been a curse, divine punishment for the sins committed on that farm. Stories began to spread faster than facts. Children were told that if they misbehaved, the Hinterkaifeck man would come for them at night. Old women crossed themselves when they passed the valley, muttering blessings to ward off evil. Even the bravest farmers refused to work the fields nearby after dusk. Fear had become its own inheritance. A few months after the murders, something strange happened. The owner of the property, a distant relative, decided to sell the land. Before the sale, workers were sent to clear the remaining debris and salvage usable timber. Among them was a laborer named Anton Bickler, who later told police that while cleaning the attic, he found a small indentation in the straw, as if someone had lain there for weeks. Next to it was an old newspaper from Munich dated March 31, the very day of the murders. The paper had not been sold in Grobern. No one could explain how it had gotten there. When Anton carried it down to show the foreman, a gust of wind swept through the empty house, slamming a door so hard it cracked the frame. The men refused to enter again after that. The cleanup was abandoned. The authorities eventually ordered the buildings demolished. By 1923, the farmhouse, barn, and stables were gone, reduced to rubble and ashes. Yet destruction did not erase the unease. Visitors to the site said they still felt watched, as though something remained behind. One witness, a traveling priest, described hearing the faint sound of a child crying near the foundation stones. When he followed the noise, he found nothing but wind moving through tall grass. Another man claimed that his horse refused to pass the site, rearing and snorting in terror. Even animals, it seemed, could sense the presence that lingered there. Meanwhile, the surviving villagers struggled with guilt. They asked themselves whether they could have prevented the tragedy. Many remembered Andreas Gruber's complaints about strange noises and footprints, and how they had laughed them off. Others recalled Victoria's nervousness, her quiet pleas for help that no one took seriously. The more they thought about it, the more they realized the warning signs had been there all along, but guilt offered no comfort. It only deepened the shadow the murders had cast over their lives. Over time, the farm became a place of pilgrimage for the morbidly curious. Journalists, photographers, and thrill-seekers traveled from across Germany to see the infamous site. They walked among the ruins, took pieces of stone as keepsakes, and wrote sensational stories for newspapers hungry for horror. Some even camped near the site at night, daring each other to stay until dawn. Few lasted long. Those who did often returned pale and trembling, claiming they had heard whispering in the dark, or footsteps circling their tents when no one was there. It was like the land itself was breathing, one reporter wrote. A slow, cold breath that brushed against the skin and whispered, "Leave." By the late 1920s, the story of Hinterkaifeck had become legend. People spoke of it in taverns and around kitchen tables, lowering their voices when they mentioned the Gruber name. It became part of local folklore, a cautionary tale about greed, secrecy, and the price of sin. But not all who spoke of it did so with fear. Some felt fascination instead, a dark curiosity that pulled them toward the unsolved mystery. Writers published pamphlets, crime enthusiasts debated suspects. The more time passed, the less the murders felt real, until someone would visit the site again and remember that 6 people, including 2 children, had died there in silence. Even as decades passed, the investigation never fully closed. Files were reopened, new theories proposed. In the 1930s, a former police officer claimed he had solved the case privately, naming a suspect long dead. But he refused to share the name publicly, saying, "It would destroy a family still living among us." In the 1950s, post-war investigators revisited the evidence using newer forensic methods, but the materials had deteriorated. The skulls of the victims, once sent to Munich for study, were lost during the bombings of World War II. With them vanished any hope of new clues. It was as though the case itself had been swallowed by history. Yet the stories continued to evolve. Survivors from Grobern, now old and gray, told interviewers that the nights following the murders were the coldest they had ever known. One woman said she woke to see a light moving slowly across the fields, like a lantern carried by invisible hands. Another claimed that her father dreamed of Victoria, standing at the edge of his bed, whispering for her son. Whether these were memories or manifestations of guilt, no one could say, but every tale added another layer to the haunting, until the tragedy no longer felt like an event, but a living presence. By the time the century turned, Hinterkaifeck had become one of Europe's most infamous unsolved murders. Researchers studied it like a puzzle. Crime historians compared it to modern serial killings. Some even suggested that the murderer might have struck elsewhere afterward, vanishing into anonymity. A few connected the case to later crimes across Bavaria, noting similar wounds, similar patterns of silence. If the killer had survived, he would have carried the memory of that night with him. A ghost of his own making. For the people of Grobern, however, the haunting was not in books or reports. It was in the land itself. Even today, they say the soil grows nothing where the farmhouse once stood. Grass covers the spot, but beneath it, the earth is dark and dry. Travelers who visit often describe a strange heaviness, a feeling that the air itself remembers. There is a simple wooden cross there now, marked with the names of the dead. Visitors leave flowers, candles, and sometimes coins, offerings for peace in a place that has never truly known it. And so, the story of Hinterkaifeck lives on, not through justice, but through fear. It reminds people that evil can hide behind ordinary walls, that a quiet farmhouse can hold horrors no one imagines until it's too late. In every retelling, the details shift, but the essence remains the same: an isolated family, a silent killer, and a mystery that refuses to die. It is a story about darkness, not just in the world but within human hearts. Even now, when the wind moves across the Bavarian fields, locals say it carries faint echoes. The creak of wood, the cry of a child, the sound of an axe striking hay. They say that if you stand there at dusk and listen closely, you might still hear it, the whisper of the unseen, asking why no one ever came in time. The years passed, but Hinterkaifeck never truly faded from memory. Like an open wound, the story festered beneath the surface of Bavarian life, whispered in bars and kitchens long after the farm itself was gone. It was not merely a crime anymore. It was an obsession, and as Germany itself was reshaped by the tides of war, defeat, and reconstruction, the legend of the Gruber's murder evolved with each retelling. In a way, the ghost of Hinterkaifeck became part of the country's haunted conscience, a reflection of guilt, silence, and the darkness that people carry with them long after the blood dries. In the 1930s, a new generation of detectives inherited the old police files. Many were young men who had grown up hearing their parents speak of the murders in hushed tones. They pored over yellowed papers, photographs, and transcripts, trying to make sense of what their elders had failed to solve. The evidence, though meager, still stirred fascination. The axe, the footprints, the eerie signs of someone living on the property before the murders. But without new witnesses or forensic science, the case was like trying to assemble a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Still, the story refused to die. Even as other tragedies gripped Europe, Hinterkaifeck lingered, a quiet whisper amid the chaos. Then came the Second World War. The files, like so many others, were relocated for safekeeping during the bombings. The skulls of the 6 victims, which had been preserved in Munich for forensic study, were sent to be re-examined. But somewhere amid the destruction of 1944, they vanished. Some say they were destroyed in a bombing raid, others believe they were lost in bureaucratic confusion or stolen by morbid collectors. Whatever the truth, their disappearance only deepened the mystery. The victims were now headless even in death, a grotesque metaphor for a story that would never have closure. And with the loss of those remains, any chance of modern forensic re-examination was gone forever. After the war, Germany was broken, physically and spiritually, yet amid rebuilding, the legends resurfaced. In the late 1940s, rural Bavaria was still steeped in superstition. The older villagers who remembered Hinterkaifeck told newcomers to avoid the area after dark. Travelers passing through the valley reported strange lights at night, flickering like lanterns where the farmhouse once stood. One farmer claimed that when he plowed near the site, His oxen refused to move forward, eyes rolling with panic. Others spoke of voices carried on the wind, murmuring prayers or pleading for help. Most dismissed these tales as country gossip, but not everyone was so certain. In 1952, a journalist named Joseph Ludwig decided to investigate the old story for a Munich newspaper. He was a rational man, skeptical of folklore, but intrigued by the mystery's endurance. He traveled to Grubern, expecting to find little more than old gossip. Instead, he found something stranger. The locals refused to speak on record. Some locked their doors when he approached. Others warned him not to go near the field where the farm once stood. One elderly woman, nearly blind, told him in a trembling voice, "They never left. You can hear them when the moon is full." Joseph laughed at first, but curiosity drove him to visit the site alone one night. What he experienced there became the most famous part of his article, and the reason he never returned. He wrote that he arrived at dusk with only a lantern and notebook. The air was still unnaturally quiet. The ruins were gone, replaced by overgrown grass and a wooden cross erected by the village in memory of the dead. He walked the perimeter, taking notes, then sat near the cross. As the night deepened, he claimed to hear faint rustling, as though footsteps were circling him. At first, he assumed it was animals. But when he shone his lantern, the sound stopped. A few minutes later, it began again, this time closer. The air grew cold. He said the light dimmed on its own, flickering as though something breathed upon it. Then came the sound of a woman's voice whispering just behind him. He turned, but saw no one. The words were soft, almost inaudible. Kommt wieder. He will come again. Ludwig fled, dropping his notebook in the dirt. The next day, a local farmer found it and returned it to him. The final line he had written before running was simple: "They are here." His article was published, sparking a new wave of fascination with Hinterkaifeck and controversy. Some accused him of fabricating the story to sell papers. Others believed he had genuinely encountered something on that field. Either way, the legend grew. The site, long abandoned, became a magnet for paranormal enthusiasts and true crime researchers alike. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, new theories emerged. One criminologist proposed that the murders were the work of a wandering soldier traumatized by war. Another believed it was a neighbor driven mad by jealousy. In 1971, a retired detective named Konrad Müller, who had studied the original case as a young man, revealed that he had long suspected one of the Gruber's acquaintances, a man who had mysteriously disappeared soon after the killings. But when pressed for a name, Müller refused. "It would serve no purpose now," he said. "The dead are at peace. The living have forgotten." Yet no one truly forgot. The case remained unsolved, a ghost among Germany's darker chapters. In the 1980s, modern forensic experts attempted to reconstruct the murders using the surviving records. They analyzed photographs, crime scene sketches, and witness statements. Some concluded that the killer had been deeply familiar with the family, perhaps even one of them. The brutality, the methodical concealment of bodies, and the calm presence on the farm afterward all pointed to someone who felt at home there. But who could have done it? Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was rumored to be violent and abusive. Some believed he was the true monster, that the killings might have been the violent eruption of years of hidden sins. Others suggested that the murders were revenge, a punishment for crimes that the Grubers themselves had committed in secret. No theory ever fit completely. Every answer led only to more questions. As television and radio embraced the story, Hinterkaifeck became a cultural phenomenon. Documentaries aired, dramatizations were filmed, and paranormal investigators brought their recording equipment to the site. In 1992, a popular German TV program conducted a séance there for a live audience. What began as spectacle ended in panic when one of the mediums began screaming uncontrollably, claiming she felt hands tightening around her throat. The broadcast was cut short. Viewers later reported seeing strange mist-like figures in the background of the footage. Whether those shapes were tricks of light or something more, no one could say. But the incident reignited belief that the ghosts of Hinterkaifeck had never left. By the early 2000s, the case had drawn international attention. True crime communities online began revisiting the story, analyzing every piece of evidence in painstaking detail. Digital forums filled with armchair detectives debating the identity of the killer, Some users unearthed forgotten documents, while others traveled to Bavaria to walk the same ground where it happened. One researcher even claimed to have found DNA traces from a tool believed to be connected to the murders. Though the results were inconclusive, the mystery persisted, adapting to each new generation of investigators. Like a curse, it bound people to its unanswered question, who killed the Gruber family? But there was another side to the story, one that went beyond logic or evidence. Residents near the site still reported strange experiences. A man walking his dog at dusk claimed the animal froze and began growling at something invisible. A woman driving home one foggy night saw a faint light in the distance, flickering in the exact place where the farmhouse once stood. She slowed her car, and as she did, the light vanished, replaced by the faint outline of figures standing in the mist. When she blinked, they were gone. Locals began to avoid the road altogether, especially in winter when fog rolled low and heavy across the fields. They said the air there was different, colder, heavier, as though the past refused to rest. In 2012, German police officially closed the case once and for all. The files were sealed, the evidence archived. But even then, the story refused silence. Visitors continued to leave flowers and candles by the memorial cross, their flickering flames a fragile gesture against the vast darkness. To this day, paranormal investigators report electronic voice phenomena at the site, faint recordings of crying, whispering, or distant footsteps. One team claimed to have captured a voice saying a single word in Bavarian dialect, "Bleib," stay. There are still those who believe that Hinterkaifeck is more than a crime scene, that it is a place where the boundary between the living and the dead has thinned. Perhaps it's not the victims who linger, but the echo of the fear that gripped the valley that cold March night in 1922. Fear, after all, is a kind of haunting. It feeds on silence, grows with time, and seeps into those who dare to remember. And so, over a century later, the legend endures. The Gruber family, their quiet farmhouse, the sound of the axe in the night, all remain frozen in time, replayed endlessly in the minds of those who study, visit, or simply hear the tale. Each generation inherits the same question, the same chill down the spine. Hinterkaifeck is no longer just a story about murder. It is about the way horror embeds itself in history, how the unexplainable refuses to fade. The land keeps its secrets, the silence keeps its power, and somewhere, perhaps, the killer's shadow still walks beneath the Bavarian moon. More than a century has passed since that cold March night in 1922, and yet the story of Hinterkaifeck refuses to rest. The world has changed, nations have fallen, technology has transformed how we see and remember, but this one tragedy, hidden in a small Bavarian valley, continues to grip the imagination. It has survived not just as a case file, but as something larger, something almost mythical. The very name, Hinterkaifeck, has become a ghostly echo in the collective mind, a reminder of how little separates the safety of home from the horrors that lurk just beyond the walls. Why does this story persist? Partly because it has no ending. The human mind craves closure, an explanation that turns chaos into reason, terror into understanding. But Hinterkaifeck offers none. It leaves us suspended in uncertainty, forced to face a truth far more unsettling than any ghost, that evil can arise without warning, without sense, without motive. The Grubers were ordinary people living ordinary lives, and in that ordinariness lies the story's horror. There was no grand scheme, no supernatural curse, only the sudden eruption of violence that shattered their world. And when we look at that farmhouse in our imagination, we see not just their tragedy, we see the fragile illusion of safety we build around our own lives. The farmhouse itself is gone, demolished decades ago, but in many ways, it still stands. Every retelling rebuilds it, the old wooden beams creaking under snow, the low roofline pressing into a gray sky, the wind whispering through the barn. We imagine the family gathered around the hearth, unaware that the killer already watches them from the shadows. That image lingers because it touches something ancient in us, the primal fear of being watched, of being hunted where we should be most secure. Hinterkaifeck reminds us that the line between the known and the unknown can vanish in an instant. One moment you're home, the next, the darkness has stepped inside, and then there is the silence. The crime scene was eerily quiet when the bodies were found. No one heard screams. No one saw lights. It was as if the world itself had turned its face away. That silence, that suffocating absence of sound, has become part of the legend. It symbolizes the things we refuse to confront. The family secrets, the isolation, the hidden violence that festers behind closed doors. Perhaps that's why the case continues to resonate. It's not just about one act of murder. It's about the silence that surrounds all acts of cruelty, the way communities look away until it's too late. As time went on, storytellers began to fill that silence with ghosts. They imagined the Gruber family haunting the valley, trapped in an endless loop of terror. Visitors claimed to see figures in old-fashioned clothing near the memorial cross, or hear the distant thud of an axe echoing across the fields. Rational minds dismiss these as tricks of light and sound, yet something in us wants to believe. We prefer ghosts to emptiness. A haunting, at least, offers a kind of continuity. The dead still have a voice. The alternative, that the Grubers simply vanished into senseless history, feels unbearable. So we breathe life into their story again and again, refusing to let it die. But Hinterkaifeck is not merely a ghost story. It is a mirror. It reflects our fascination with evil, not the cinematic kind, but the quiet, patient kind that waits. In every era, people return to this story not just to be frightened, but to understand. We want to know what drives someone to pick up an axe and destroy an entire family. Was it madness, revenge, or something darker, something that cannot be named? Every theory feels incomplete because the truth of violence rarely fits inside human logic. The killer's face remains invisible, but perhaps that's fitting. In that facelessness, we see the most terrifying possibility, that it could be anyone. That evil is not some distant creature, but something ordinary people are capable of becoming. In the decades that followed, artists, writers, and filmmakers drew inspiration from Hinterkaifeck. The story's elements, the isolation, the footsteps in the attic, the cold efficiency of the murders, appeared in countless horror works. Yet none of them captured the true essence of it, the realism. This was no supernatural tale invented to frighten children. It was real, flesh, blood, and bone. And perhaps that is what makes it worse than any ghost story ever told. The Grubers were not characters. They were human beings who lived, worked, and died in terror. Their story is not a legend. It is evidence. Evidence that horror does not need the supernatural, it only needs humanity. For the villagers of Groburn, the haunting was not an idea. It was a way of life. Even generations later, descendants spoke of an invisible weight that hung over their community. Children grew up hearing their grandparents' stories, feeling the chill of fear inherited from those who first found the bodies. Some swore they could still hear the farm animals crying at night. Others avoided the field altogether, convinced that to walk there was to invite misfortune. When visitors arrived, the locals would guide them politely but warn them not to stay after sunset. It's not a place for the living, they would say. It remembers. And maybe that's what sets Hinterkaifeck apart from other unsolved murders. The way it continues to breathe, it's as if the land itself became part of the story, refusing to let the truth decay. Over the decades, storms have passed, grass has grown, and yet the soil where the farmhouse once stood remains barren and strange. Farmers say their tools rust faster there. Birds do not perch on the wooden cross. On quiet nights, even modern travelers report a sense of being observed, not by something visible, but by the memory of something that refuses to fade. In that sense, Hinterkaifeck is more than a story. It's a scar that history will not heal. Every generation rediscovers it. Investigators reopen the case files, journalists retrace the path to the valley, and each time, the same question rises: why does this still matter? The answer lies in what it reveals about us. We are creatures obsessed with the unknown, drawn to the places where reason fails. Hinterkaifeck stands at the intersection of truth and fear, a real event that feels almost supernatural because it defies resolution. The more we study it, the less we understand, and in that confusion, we find the essence of horror itself, not the presence of evil, but the absence of explanation. As the decades turn into centuries, Hinterkaifeck's legacy continues to evolve. It appears in podcasts, documentaries, online discussions, always retold, never resolved. Each new medium gives it another form, another audience. But beneath all the analysis and speculation, The same core remains, 6 lives brutally ended in the dead of night by a hand that was never named. It is that void, that endless, echoing uncertainty, that keeps the story alive. The Gruber's killer took their lives, but not their voices. Their silence still speaks louder than any confession ever could. In the end, perhaps that is the real reason Hinterkaifeck haunts us. It is not only the brutality of the murders or the mystery of the culprit. It is the reflection of our own fears. We fear isolation. We fear betrayal from those we trust. We fear the possibility that evil can live beside us, unnoticed, until it's too late. The story touches those fears and makes them tangible. It reminds us that horror is not a thing of shadows or monsters. It is woven into ordinary life. It can hide behind a neighbor's smile, in a locked door, in the quiet creak of an empty room. So we return to Hinterkaifeck again and again because it refuses to be forgotten. The farmhouse is gone, the family is dust, and the killer's name has dissolved into rumor. But the story endures, carried by those who tell it, whispered by the wind that crosses the valley, recorded in every heartbeat that quickens when we imagine the footsteps in the attic. It endures because we need it to. It reminds us of what we are capable of, what we fear, and what we may never truly understand. And perhaps somewhere in that quiet field in Bavaria, beneath the endless turning of the seasons, the echoes still remain, faint, patient, waiting. If you ever visit, you may not see anything unusual. You may stand there and feel only the cool wind, the rustle of grass, the hum of distant life. But if you stay long enough and listen closely, you might hear something else. A whisper carried on the air, soft and almost sorrowful, saying the same thing it has said for more than 100 years. Remember us.